Good to see so many people with their priorities in the right place. Again, I've been asked to take on a topic that deserves book-length treatment and to present it in 15 minutes. So there's going to be a lot of subtleties, a lot of generalizations, but I hope to get across the main point, that what we need today in an era where we're seeing carbon dioxide contributing to the acidification of the world's oceans, where they're predicting the pH factor will drop to 7.8 by the end of this century, which means most of the coral will be gone, most of the species will be gone in the water. And where we're seeing global warming contributing to a higher rate of temperature increase in the Arctic area, which portends the possibility of release of massive amounts of methane, we're really like the frog in that pot of water who isn't aware that the water is heating up. And our taken for granted beliefs are very much like that frog. We're not aware, we're taking for granted that many of the misconceptions passed on from the past in public schools and through our universities are based on a number of misconceptions and hubris. A friend of mine in Mexico recently sent me a paper on the mathematics of the tribe of, which he referred to as the tribe of Europe. And what he was getting at is that this Western form of consciousness, which you can see very clearly in the history of Western philosophy, and if you look at Western philosophy, you see that the main things that they gave us, what continues today, and I'm going to base my thinking on that, is that they gave us the importance of priority of abstract thinking over awareness of ecological intelligence. They gave us an ethnocentric way of looking at the world, and they laid the basis for Enlightenment thinkers who ignored the importance of the cultural commons, and that is all those activities, relationships, skills, forms of knowledge, mentoring, patterns of mutual support that are put down so ruthlessly by referring to them as anybody speaking favorably for them as the Neo-Luddites. And the Enlightenment thinkers set the framework now for us to ignore what those traditions are, what you're calling local, what I'm calling the cultural commons, that is those non-monetized, intergenerational, face-to-face, low toxic, low carbon footprint kind of activities. Okay, the topic. Have I used up 5 minutes? Okay, a long ways to go. I want to frame this discussion of what's problematic about print and data by borrowing the Roman god Janus that had two faces looking in two different directions, which points out that we're not talking about either or progress. We're talking about the possibility that our achievements are also, as Bateson put it, creating double binds for us, and that is they're creating the very problems that we're trying to address and in most cases trying to ignore. So what is there about, so I'm admitting at the outset, I take data seriously, especially the data that scientists are giving us. So what is there about print and data that undermine ecological intelligence? First, let me explain that Descartes and the other philosophers got it wrong. We are all ecological thinkers. That is, we are all responding to local context in terms of emergent, relational, and codependent activities, whether you're standing at a stoplight, engaging in a conversation with somebody else, you're responding to very complex messages that are circulating within that cultural ecology. What we need is a more complex form of cultural intelligence. Many of us are beginning to understand social justice issues as part of ecological intelligence. So we pay attention to language, relationships, how people are privileged or disadvantaged, and so on. That's paying attention to the relationships, to the patterns that connect. We now need to move that to that third level of asking how do various activities, consumer habits, skills, forms of knowledge, and so on, impact our understanding of natural systems, and I referred to those mega changes that are now beginning to take place and affecting people's lives. So what is there about print and data that are problematic? Keep in mind the Janus nature, they're positive, they're very important, they're indispensable. So it's not either or. But what do we need to understand critically in the use of print and data? Well, let me lay out three possibilities that usually are not discussed with students, either in public schools or at universities. First, you can't put any depth of knowledge of an ecology, that is, of a relationship, an activity, of a practice in print. If you want to see the limitations of print, just look at what happens when you're standing on the beach and waves are crashing against the rock. Then you ask, how much of that can you put into print? It's a fragment. And more importantly, what you put into print is immediately dated in addition to being shallow. That doesn't mean we can't update, go to greater depths and so on. But the point is, and this is where we need to challenge this notion that what is in print is objective, it's factual, it plays a particular role in the politics of language and relationships. Secondly, a second point I want to make is that let me summarize that a little in a clearer way. What print and data cannot do for us is provide us a knowledge of context. And context involves your taken for granted world, your memories, your relationships, what is being negotiated in those relationships with others in a mentoring activity, and so on. Now, one of the things that happens when we rely upon data and print, that is, when we're teaching students to look at the world that they're going to face and so on. How many of you are aware of the core curriculum? Not too many. How many of you have resisted it? How many of you have gone out on the sidewalk and protested? That is going to set us back for decades. And who were the people behind it? Bill Gates and Rex Tillerson, who's CEO of ExxonMobil, who makes $40 million a year. Teachers have no background, really, for understanding what its limitations are, but it's a movement toward putting more of our knowledge in print and represented it as data appearing on a screen. Okay, what happens when we encounter the printed word on a page or data and printed word on a computer screen? What goes on? What happens is that what is being reinforced is a conduit view of language, a sender-receiver way of understanding what's being communicated. This is absolutely essential for maintaining that there is such a thing as objective knowledge, that there is factual information, that human beings are not complicit in the construction of that knowledge. So what is lost in a conduit or a sender-receiver model of communication? What is lost is really fundamental, and that is that all language is metaphorical. What does that mean? It means that our words carry forward the analogies settled upon in the distant past by people who were under the influence of different cultural assumptions. Let me give you an example. The word woman is a metaphor. It's also a root metaphor, but it's a metaphor that was framed, the meaning of which was framed by people who had all kinds of biases, prejudices, silences, and an inability to see what the human behavior was really about. Okay? So the implications is that when we learn the language of our community, we're learning the thought patterns that are carried forward from the past that in effect reproduce earlier forms of intelligence or lack of intelligence. Secondly, not only are words metaphors, but the interpretive frameworks that we use to make sense of things are based on what are called root metaphors. Patriarchy was a root metaphor. Anthropocentrism is a root metaphor which represents humans as in charge of the world, to name it, to use it, to exploit it. But we have other root metaphors such as mechanism. You see this very prominent in the area of brain research. We see this mechanism prominent in education, agriculture, in all aspects of life. What a root metaphor does, such as mechanism or individualism or progress, is that it excludes other possibilities that are outside the language framework that supports that root metaphor. Increasingly, evolution is becoming a root metaphor, and people are coming up with some really, really frightening ideas, such as the computer science people who are highly educated in a very narrow area, but who totally lack an understanding of the cultures into which their technologies are introduced. But they see the changes they introduce, that is the loss of various forms of knowledge, the marginalization of jobs, the forms of knowledge that can't be encoded in print or in data. They see that as part of an evolutionary process. So what is happening is, and they're now talking about how humans are going to be bypassed by superintelligent computers, and that we're now entering what they call the post-biological phase of evolution. The root metaphor here is progress. And if you read Michiko Kaku's The Future of the Mind, where he's talking about the possibility of what the scientists, what these Promethean figures are going to do in terms of our intelligence, our memories, and so on, you find that they only see it in terms of progress. It's interesting that all the books I've read on computer scientists talking about how the world is going to be changed and improved and globalized, they never mention what is being lost. But I think your ecological intelligence tells you you've lost privacy. You've lost security in that your activities, your economic well-being and so on can be hacked. There's now this new program called ransomware, where your computer can be shut down until you pay a fee, and it has to be paid in bitcoins. So now, one third point that I want to make about print and data. Given the fact that we think within the language framework that we learn when we're born into a language community, which means ecologically, the ecology of language is telling us that we are reproducing earlier patterns of thought. We are taking these patterns of thought for granted. And then at the same time, we're reading what people are writing and what they are telling us about data. And we're saying, well, that's factual, that's objective, that has political power, and that will adapt our decisions to what the information and data are telling us. I see the 2 minutes. Data. The point that I want to make is that the writer, whether it's an Aldo Leopold or a hack, only writes what her or his interpretive framework makes available to them. So if they're not aware of how their own thought processes encode the prejudices, the silences, the ways of understanding reality, then they will reproduce that as their story or their written account. Also, what is written, whether it's in print or as data, is interpreted. And the people who interpret what's in these technologies also is influenced by her or his taken for granted assumptions, which reflects what has been encoded in the language that they have taken for granted. The critical point is that public schools and universities do not help students understand the metaphorical nature of their language. They continue to reinforce the idea of language as a sender-receiver process of communication. They continue to reinforce the idea that there's factual knowledge. And what we're hearing from the other speakers here is that the West is engaged in a very powerful process of colonization. So what I'm suggesting is that we need to look at the process of linguistic colonization of our present by our past. Now that is a tough nut to crack, because like the frog, we're all very comfortable with our vocabulary, and damn it, we just don't want to take on the challenge of learning something that we haven't thought about before. And I think that's the crisis we face. Thank you.